go.
Okay, hello and welcome to the JTFP, the official podcast of Jackson T. Fowler. And I'm joined today by the founder or editor of Anarchiwi, New Zealand anarchist libertarian historian, Rick Giles. Good morning, Rick.
Hey, how you doing?
Not bad, Rick. How are you?
Coming along not too badly.
Well, that's good to hear. So, Rick, I thought you'd be an interesting guest to have on the show, and I guess most people would probably know you from an interview you did some years ago on TV regarding Earth Hour and Edison Hour. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, looks like you've got a picture of me way back then. That was when I was national president of ACT on Campus. And
Right.
as a group, we could see this climate change stuff coming down the line. And I did everything I could to try and push a different angle on that. And it got picked up one year. And perhaps on the strength of that, the following year, TV3 got in touch twice. And I ended up going on their 6 o'clock news, and then the breakfast team picked it up as well. So I proceeded from working hard that morning to ripping into Christchurch and sitting down and having a yarn with their breakfast team, Sunrise as it was then. And then it all collapsed.
A long time
because
ago.
in that same week, that show, the tent fell in on them. Maybe it's my fault.
Well, maybe it is, Rick. So anyway, Rick, you are the your website is Anarchiwi or AHNZ.anarchiwi.co.nz, and I think you've got your logo there. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your website and the work you're doing with Anarchiwi.
I'm trying to find out New Zealand history without just absorbing it from the mainstream, whether it's the previous mainstream that we had a couple of months ago, or the new mainstream that we're being fed now, or the next mainstream that all of our kids at primary school are going to be force-fed in the government schools. And more than anything, I wanted to read that history, and nobody's written it, so I had to write it so that I could read it.
Fair enough. Yep. Right. So you tell me a little bit about your background. Obviously, you were a university student back in those days when you were on the Sunrise program. You're involved in the ACT Party. So what were you studying, and what are you doing now?
I'm very well rounded. I've studied a lot of things. At the time, I was particularly interested in philosophy, sociology, economics, and I was more interested in libertarian politics, but I was trying to facilitate my group becoming more anarchist, and with it the party, and hopefully the country and the rest of the world. And since then, I've become much more interested in psychology and latterly history.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think there's quite a few things we'll talk about on the show, but obviously you were the national president of Young ACT. Tell me, are you involved much with the ACT Party now?
No, I've decided to go full anarchy, and after that I largely stepped out. It was disappointing because I'd done a lot of work and built a big group around the country, and basically that interview split a lot of people. And that was the last time I went to an ACT Party board meeting, and I got calls from the various board leaders and the president of the party at the time, and they said to me, it's splitting the membership, you got to back down on this thing. And I said, that's great, we're finding out who our friends are, it's great, let's get rid of those people. And then they didn't see it that way at all. They're just trying to keep a sort of consolidated group of people who don't know that they disagree with each other, and keep the money flowing and the support flowing, and try and make sure that these people who disagree never meet each other.
Well, that's difficult. Well, it's interesting because obviously I've known for a while Stephen Berry, who was a member of the ACT Party for quite a while, and he got close to winning a seat in the election. And he often says that the ACT Party is a libertarian party, but with conservative voters. And I think that's quite true. And given you've now gotten into anarchist history and you've gone more in the anarchist direction, what do you think of the current ACT Party and the way that David Seymour has embraced things like vax mandates, and the direction he's gone in, which seems to me the opposite of libertarianism or anarchism?
It's a lot easier to analyze politics when you're an anarchist. It was pretty easy when I was a libertarian, and a lot of the concepts there, if I was doing some political studies papers at university, it was pretty easy for we libertarians because we had a clear view of what rights were. And now that I'm an anarchist, everything's so easy. I can all see that they're all fake, they're all positioning, they're all got brand activism, and they're trying to stay in the conformity. And so they're not anyone who's got political power in New Zealand, anyone who's in power has anything except for some outsiders who are trying to get in. They're all conforming. They're all conforming to whatever's going down. They're all playing what I call the yes and game. It's basically an improv comedy game. So, of course, acts I see at the time when I was a member, I was pretty impressed. I thought that we were going somewhere, and we did have libertarian values, and I thought, there are some conservative people, but we can talk them into it. We can discuss things with them and bring them around, but I don't view it that way anymore. And
well,
I wonder, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is that I voted for the ACT Party at the election 2 years ago now. I thought of all the parties in Parliament, they were going to be the ones who would, I guess, push libertarianism. And you know, in the last Parliament, they did a few good things when they had only Seymour as one MP. They voted against the gun buyback and the climate change bill. But what you know, when they what we found is as soon as they've got a decent caucus, and they've got 8 or 9 MPs now, and most of those MPs have been totally missing in action. And David Seymour has been basically the enemy of individual liberty and freedom as the vax rollout has gone on, as some of his public statements about the vax and unvaccinated people, you know, saying things like, don't be a dick if you're unvaccinated. And so I think a lot of people who voted for the ACT Party because they thought he would be a libertarian party are incredibly disappointed.
Well, as rightly they should be. I hope they learn from that the way I did.
Well, absolutely.
I don't know what happened to Stephen. Don't vote at all, mate.
No, well, I probably won't. Either that or I'll destroy my paper.
Well, ideally, get off the electoral list. They're keeping an eye on you. They'll come round. They know where you live. Stephen Berry and I actually came up in the Libertarians Party together. Back
was
in the day.
with Will Ryan as well?
No, he just appeared on the radar a couple of years ago. He seems like a real angry dude, but then a few seconds before that, he seemed like he was willing to reason. But I've seen him since. I had a good old long yarn with him on the phone. Oh, I don't know, a couple of months ago, a few months back last year.
All right.
Maybe he'll come around again, but I don't know. Like a lot of people who are getting left behind or pushed out of the consensus group.
Yep.
You get irritated. You end up pissing yourself off. And I can relate to that too. I don't know. Yeah, it was after I exited the party that Stephen came along, and a lot of the people who are now MPs, I was working with them at the time. They've been in the ACT Party for a long time, which I think is how they ended up on the list and sort of stumbled into Parliament. I was campaign manager for one of them, and I think they're kind of in trouble, and they're managing it by keeping them. You know, keep them behind David, keep their mouths shut. The main damage control thing to do is to make sure they don't talk or they're going to screw something up and just make things worse. Because they're not, you know, it's good in some ways, but they are not used to fighting in that pit and, you know, facing that hostile media that'll only too happily, throw them under the bus, and they're looking forward to probably in the course of the year whittling them down and replacing them, and whoever's next on the ACT Party list is probably going to climb up it because there's going to be some Swiss cheese getting made, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the problem that a lot of minor parties have is that the sort of people they attract to go on their list are perhaps not the best natural politicians. And so they're more prone to perhaps speaking out of turn or creating a headache for the party. And I mean, how many MPs has Winston Peters had to sack over the years for stepping out of line? And so I think, yeah, you're right. The best strategy has been just to keep their mouth shut, head down, and let Seymour do all the talking. But I think, yeah, a lot of people voted for him, and they expected more. And certainly, I won't be voting for any, mainstream political party. If I do vote, it'll probably be for someone like the Outdoors Party, Sue Gray, someone like that, or just not voting at all, because I think a lot of people are now coming along to the realization that democracy is dead, and that you're never going to get any genuine change through Parliament because the system is designed to prevent it. Would you agree?
Well, yeah. See, I listened to a couple of your podcasts preceding, and I do hear you talking about democracy being dead and things being bad and the media is our enemy. But did it occur to you that it always has been? This isn't anything new. It's going back some time now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people have been, like yourself, have been saying this stuff for years. And I think you're absolutely right. And the more you look into it, the more you understand that, as you say, all our history is a lie. The things we're taught in school are lies. The things politicians say to us are lies. The things the media report to us, it's all lies. And so it's really a fake system. And by voting, you're only legitimizing that system.
Absolutely. You're participating, and you're, in particular, the great thing you get when you stop participating is you stop waiting for them to come. You stop channeling your civic energy into politicians. You just cast your vote, then you sit back and you think, hey, these guys are going to take care of business for me. I've done my democratic business. I don't need to take an interest. And, it's the same thing if there's a pothole outside your house and it's really bugging you. They make us into what I call victimhood culture, because if you, say, living in the settlement era or the Crown Colony of New Zealand, you just get out there and you'd fix that hole. If you do that today, you're liable to get arrested or something. So you're forced to, you're in trouble. You broke something. You made a staircase without permission from the government. You did something for yourself. You did it cheaper. You did it for free. You did it without, a little piece of paper to say that you could do it from Ron Swanson or something. And so what do? You're forced simply to complain, to write letters to the editor, to try and ask and plead for the government to do it for you. And so, because of this system, which is increasingly taking over much more than potholes, it turns the nation into a nation of people who are begging and pleading for their life's substance, instead of being doers, instead of having social capital like we used to.
Yeah, well, I saw a really interesting comment of yours, Rick, just before Christmas, and it was on an article of a man campaigning to have mandatory alarms in cars if there's a kid in the back you've forgotten about. And I thought, for goodness sake. And you said, this sort of stuff will only make us more irresponsible. How about, instead of, putting alarms in cars, people make responsible choices for who they have children with and who they leave in charge of their children.
And sounds like me talking all right.
Well, that's exactly what you said. And I thought, exactly right. But it's like that. It's a bit of an old term now, the nanny state. But it's absolutely true. And it's, I guess, whether you call it nanny state, politically correct, or even woke, it's really the same thing. And as the government takes over more and more responsibility of our daily lives, it's like with these lockdowns. I'm against lockdowns in principle, because I believe people will take responsibility for their own health. If they believe that going out might get them killed, then chances are they won't go out. And And so, it's like the Black Death. No one had to be told every 5 minutes on the radio or TV or YouTube that there was a pandemic on, because people knew. Whereas with this bullshit pandemic, if people stopped talking about it for 5 minutes, the whole thing would go away.
That is the main difference, broadly speaking, between propaganda and advertising. You do not need to propagandize children to watch cartoons or eat sugar or like toys. You just advertise and they come running. But when there's something that people don't want to do and that they're resistant to, only propaganda will do. You need to tell them how to think, what their conclusions are. And as you've outlined yourself, the media, the fourth estate, and the state itself, the government, they've got everything tied up in a neat little package with their, nightly bulletins telling everyone what to think and leaflets in the letterbox.
Yep. Yeah, well,
but I wouldn't blame them. That's another main point, if I may, that we were begging for it. I do not see this situation as the government forcing it down our throats so much as the culture of New Zealand, like this fellow who lost his kid in the car. They're crying out for this sort of thing, and the government just rubs its hands together and says, what can we get away with today? And they roll it on out.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Well, and as you say about the TV telling people what to think, something interesting that Vince McLeod points out is that the TV in New Zealand, or the mainstream media, don't tell people how to think. They tell people what others are thinking. So when you turn on the TV and you just have, normally the first, at least 10 minutes are about the vax or whatever, and they're interviewing people on the street, and they say, what do you think of the unvax? And they say, oh, I think they're bloody stupid. They should just have it. And the average person is not wanting to be any different. It's like the I forget what it's called. I think the Ash experiment, where you ask a bunch of people to give a wrong answer, and then the last person gives the same wrong answer because they refuse to stand out. And it's the same principle that the television works under, is that people will start adopting the same line as their neighbor or friend or someone they work with, because they just don't want to stand out from the crowd, because we're not designed that way. We're a herd animal.
I wouldn't put it that way. I'd put some more nuance on that. That's very astute observation. Vince is onto it. He's got a lot of things figured out. I think so. There's a certain vision that comes from being outside of the normal, by not going along with, drinking the Kool-Aid and having a different perspective. And you can see so much just by doing that, just by not necessarily what you do believe in, but by what you don't believe in. You're not being misinformed and swallowing what you're force-fed by the state. The nuance would be, I don't think that we are a herd animal. I think we have fluctuations. And part of my interest in writing posts for Anarchist History of New Zealand is to try and pinpoint what those cycles are. I can see 80-year cycles, 20-year cycles, 5-year cycles. And I think right now we're in a cycle that I call personality culture. So people are very identitarian. They think by proxy rather than for themselves. They don't know how to think. And they cast about, don't they, looking for some big boss figure so that they can conform to them and their authority. So their arguments are from authority. And, noticing the change online, if you talk to people, in the street, or even watching mainstream media or just television shows these days, people don't have philosophical arguments for what they believe in. They haven't got a goddamn clue. They'll just say, Cinders and Ash told me.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And people, the big thing I think now is that people are willing to deny reality. They're willing to deny the evidence of their own eyes. They will believe in what the TV tells them over what they know to be true themselves. And I saw someone on Twitter a couple of days ago, might have been yesterday, or day before. They posted up, they said, I've just booked in for my booster, and hopefully I don't get any reaction. I didn't have any reaction to the first two. And I thought, that's interesting. So I went back and looked, and the same person posted about 5 months ago, 6 months ago, when they had the second vax, that they had a really bright red, itchy, hard patch on their arm that lasted about a week, and they had to go to the doctor. And then here they are 6 months later, in denial, saying, "Oh, I didn't have any reaction at all, so I'll be fine." And
well,
people
that's
have just
personality culture.
Absolutely. And people are just willing to deny the evidence of their own eyes. They're willing to deny what's right in front of them to be part of this COVID cult.
Yeah, it's been that way for a while. I'm expecting it to break during the 2020s. The next few years, this should turn around, because it's been going on since approximately 2016 now, and hopefully the New Zealand cycle will wrap it up. Well, let's see. I think there's two parts to personality culture. This is where the theory of moral cultures comes in, which is a big bit of intellectual furniture that I use to interpret New Zealand history. And what comes first is victimhood culture, and then comes slave culture.
Yes.
And what happens, without getting into how those are generated, what slave culture generates in turn is honor culture. It's a kind of enantiodromia. It's a part of logos theory where something becomes its opposite. It transforms into its opposite self. So we start off in victimhood culture. We go to slave culture. Think of it like people are just a common sense idea that New Zealanders in the mainstream has become slaves. We're doing as we're told. We're getting bossed around.
I've said that several times. Yep.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. You can pretty much see that's the condition we're in now.
Yes.
And then what happens in the next phase, which we're already beginning, which isn't mainstream yet, is that the people who do best in a world like that are honor culture people. So they're sort of like Conan the Barbarian. They're thugs, they're gang members, they're Al Capone, they're non-official police forces, they're motorcycle gangs, they're Maori activists. And they're throwing their weight around. They basically go up to the beach where the slave culture kids are. They kick over their sand castles. They throw sand in their face. They take their lunch money and push them over in the sand and take their girls away. And slaves can't fight back. What the slaves were conditioned to do is put up their hand and ask the victimhood culture protectors, these guys are hurting me, please send them to the principal's office. As victimhood culture can no longer supply those needs because they're running out of other people's money, slave culture, they've got infinite demands and infinite wants. They can't be supplied anymore. They turn on victimhood culture. They become the new mainstream, but then there's no one to protect them. It's unstable. Honor culture comes along and starts pushing them over and taking over the mainstream culture in New Zealand. And there's the rise of crime. The people are shooting each other in Auckland, left, right, and centre. You've got motorcycle gangs pushing through lockdown boundaries. You've got, all sorts of border stops and things like that. So that starts rising up, and we become a country like that. And that's once that escalates, I think New Zealand goes into one of its periodic honor culture phases, which is good for television because I'm sick of all this woke stuff on TV. We'll get some more crocodile hunter and ass kicking stuff instead.
Well, rather than honor culture and slave culture and personality culture, I think some people, Vince McLeod included, use the term clown world, and that's something that we've done at least 2 podcasts on, although it's sort of a recurring theme through all the podcasts. And I'm not sure exactly what you think of that idea, but I mean, I agree with most of what you've said, and that since 2016, particularly the last 5 years now, we have been in a cycle of who can be the biggest victim, who can be the most oppressed, and as Vince McLeod argues, victimhood is aggression. And saying I'm the victim. You don't agree?
No, it's not aggressive. It's a different means of production than aggression. Victimhood isn't aggressive themselves, even necessarily. I don't think they're passive aggressive or aggressive in any sense. They leave the aggression to other people. Basically, they thrive in a culture where you can stand up and point to something and say, that's not fair. and someone from the dignity culture will come along and go, oh, that's horrible. Think of a rich industrialist or something with a wife who's hanging on and complaining and crying and threatening to, I don't know, cry if he doesn't get his wallet out and give some money to these poor little orphans. So he's the dignity culture guy, and he's in decline. He's just forking out this money until his wallet's empty. The woman who is, just to be stereotypical, it's quite a feminine thing, the victimhood culture. She just cries and whimpers, seduces, or if she's old and ugly, she just bitches. It's the two phases of being a victimhood culture person. And other people will supply the aggression for them.
But isn't summoning others to be aggressive, isn't that a form of aggression itself? And when I say that victimhood is a form of aggression, you can take any number of examples. For example, Muslims in the West, they're constantly complaining about how hard they have it, constantly complaining about how everyone's racist. And if I'm calling someone, or a Muslim's calling someone racist every single day, even members of parliament now, some Green MPs, parasites who are calling everyone, that's white supremacy, destroy white supremacy, that's racist.
Yeah.
I believe that to be a form of aggression, because the reason they're complaining is because they want it to be made fair, or they want justice. And by demanding justice that's undeserved, or demanding special treatment, or more rights, or more privileges, or more money, or whatever it is that not a form of aggression in itself, summoning others to be aggressive?
Not if you want to get technical about it. It's not. There's a big book of Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. He talks about this, and what if you order an attack dog to go attack somebody? He would say that's an action of yours. Or if you'd push a button or pull a trigger, that's an action of yours. For sure. If the dog's aggressive, you have been aggressive. But in this case, I attribute to the various cultures, there are 4 of them, they're all humans, they're all either neglecting their rights and responsibilities, or they are actively shirking them. So consciousness comes into it. There's a choice to be made. Now, just because you've got some victimhood culture Muslim or feminist or environmentalist or whatever else comes out of the woodwork at a given time that's effective on picking the pockets of dignity culture, doesn't mean that you have to do it. If they're pointing and saying, lynch this guy, hang him from a tree because we don't like what he's smoking, or whatever contrived bullshit,
put him in a cage,
because we don't like, right? You don't have to do it. So the human action part initiates when the enforcer for victimhood culture has low boundaries and does as they're told, and goes and beats up that guy, or lynches this guy, or taxes this guy, or breaks into his house and steals his guns. That person is responsible, contrary to what we're constantly fed, which is whoever the police are or the border people are, they're just doing their job. Don't get angry at the shop people who are enforcing these laws. They're not responsible. Well, I say they are. Point. So that's where the aggression
I agree
begins.
with you. Absolutely. And what I sometimes say to people is that there are no truly good police officers, and people will chimp out at that point, and they'll say, oh, my brother's in the police, my friend, best friend, he's been a police officer 20 years, he's great, he'd never do anything wrong. And I say, well, given the New Zealand police and the state are currently violating several sections of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, including the lockdowns and the borders outside of Auckland, stopping people traveling through the country, which they have a right to do, given the New Zealand state being enforced by the police is preventing unvaccinated people like teachers and doctors and midwives from doing their job. That's at the hands of the New Zealand police. Given the New Zealand police keeping surveillance on New Zealanders who have different opinions, people like Vinnie Eastwood, Vince McLeod, people like that, given they are raiding people's homes to, firearms license holders, breaking in their home when they're out, stealing their guns, rifling through their drawers, just visiting people to sort of scare them into submission. I say any member of the New Zealand police is in part responsible for that. And if they didn't want
Why
to be
not broaden it
responsible,
out to the entire public service?
yeah, well, you can even make that argument. If you're in any way contributing to the tyranny that we're living under, you're in part responsible for it. And when
Or
people
even
say,
if you're not, anyone who doesn't take responsibility but just follows orders, so the tax department decides, this tax bracket's going to get hit, or this part of land is now to be seized and nationalised under the
yep,
umbrella guise branding of a significant natural area, or we've decided to
yes,
seize your
yes,
waters.
yep,
It's anyone who's doing that, the grey ones, the bureaucrats,
yeah.
all of these guys are just doing as they're told and going with the flow, and they don't push back. So
Well, absolutely. And saying that, oh, they're just following orders, that's
yeah,
not an argument. That just doesn't wash with me or anyone else, I'm afraid. Really, that's just rubbish. Because
it's a level in the apologetics. People step through a certain 5 layers of apology, and that's
yep,
just one of them that they go to on the way
yes,
to a metaphysical excuse.
yes. And what would you like if you expand that idea out? I think VJM Publishing wrote an article that said if you're capable of following orders, then you're capable of committing murder. And he sort of stretched it out to say, you're in a field, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're in a war, you're covered in blood and things, and a bunch of enemy soldiers have been rounded up, and you've been ordered to shoot them all, even though some of them may be totally innocent. And most people, more than 95, 97% of people would just shoot them, no questions asked. And it's the same principle as a New Zealand police officer who says, well, I'm really against mandates, but I'm going to go and enforce them anyway because that's what I've been told to do.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
What can you summarize that? Do I agree that most people would shoot people, or
that most people would be capable of murder if they were told to by an authority figure?
it depends what time period you're in. In a personality culture time period, which consists of victimhood culture
Yeah.
and honor culture, absolutely, that's how it works. People aren't
Yes.
thinking for themselves and
No.
deciding, and wars can't be fought that way. If the general tries to pass down some Chinese whispers to some scout to knock over a tree, please, and it goes down the control line, and they're all asking, "Oh, what for?" Can you explain your reasoning, General?
Yep.
You're never
Yeah.
going to get anything
It's
done.
going to fall
So all of
apart.
the
Yeah.
war, yeah, it can't be done. You need to have basically people get trained. They get their minds broken in basic training, just as they do in the SAS and the police force and in traditional Maori nobility culture. They go into these break your mind, rebuild you from the ground up situations so that you'll follow orders with reflex. And that sort of training, as many New Zealanders in our history books point out, that saved their lives. They knew when to duck, they knew when to take cover, they could work in a coordinated effort, and in a war zone you need to be able to do that.
Yeah, so tell me what do you think has contributed to the rise of personality culture and victimhood culture? What do you think brought it in, and why? What was the root cause of it, do you think? Because you said that you don't think the government's, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, you don't think the government's forcing it on us, but people are begging for it. And that's true. People are begging for it. It's like the social credit system with the Vax passport. People were begging, please bring in the Vax passport. Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. They were begging for it. But the idea obviously originates from the government, from the ruling class. So where do you think what is the basis of this personality culture? When
You
did
mean
it start?
originally, like hundreds of years ago, or do you just mean the latest iteration? Because this is a cycle.
Yeah, I mean probably the latest iteration of it in the West.
Well, put it this way: I was watching Seinfeld, that show,
Right.
last night
Yep.
on, must have been on Netflix or something, And that was re-released a couple of years ago. I saw at the bus stops all around New Zealand, Seinfeld was being advertised, even though that show was way old.
Oh, it's more than 20 years old, yeah.
So why is that popular again? And a 20-year cycle, exactly what the theory of moral cultures predict. Seinfeld is a slave culture TV show. The whole premise of that show revolves around the four characters, Jerry Seinfeld and his three friends, having no personal boundary. The plot couldn't happen if he could just say no. So if someone says, you got to wear a puffy shirt on my TV, or you got to have a bad haircut because you don't want to offend this guy, or you got to do what the soup Nazi says, episode after episode, it wouldn't happen if he just said no. But because it's slave culture, it's cathartic to the people watching at the time, and it's cathartic to people 20 years after that, and 20 years after that, and 20 years before that. We're a nation of people who do as they're told. So that slave culture, engenders the next round of honor culture, and that engenders the next round of dignity culture. And now we're, those two are case elected, not to expand your mind too much, but there's a whole lot of models that I use that work together. So you've got your R-selected and K-selected cycles. You've got your personality and institutional cycles, and within those, we're basically going DC, dignity culture, to H, to victimhood culture, VC, becomes slave culture, becomes honor culture, becomes dignity culture, and there's another cycle round we go again.
Yep. Do you think there's any chance for us to escape this cycle and replace it with a better kind of culture? Or do you think it's the inevitable cycle, we'll never get out of it?
Yeah, no, that is, first you've got to recognize the cycle, and then you've got to make that choice. And it's not an easy one to make, because there's a lot to be said for the cycle. Before I answer your question, I think about it. This New Zealand, like the rest of the world, humanity is a compound species. We're like lichen. We're not just one thing. And all of these different cycles help us grow. You go from R-selected to K-selected. One kind of grouping creates more New Zealanders, is very successful. Population shoots up. And then the other one tries to conserve and consolidate and build infrastructure and bring reason and evidence and keep those people alive. And then it gives, but it's not great for breeding necessarily. You don't have lots and lots of children when you're being conservative. But then it switches over to R-selected, and kids start coming out like popcorn. So between the two, we're getting ahead. And also these victimhood culture, dignity culture, slave culture, honor culture. The honor culture that we're about to have is not going to be like the honor culture we had in the 1980s or during the war era or the turn of the century. They all get better. Technology improved. We're doing it with computers now and cell phones. They didn't have 200 years ago when they were doing the same thing. So it's kind of like we're swimming around in a circle, getting further and further ahead. It's kind of like tacking a sailboat or something. So, there's a lot to be said for just leaving this great cultural machine alone to work, and it will push us forward. Trouble is, it ruins people, it turns people into leaves in the wind and crushes over them. And, hey, bad news, your culture is no longer popular. You're out on the street. You guys are, for example, the old folks who didn't learn how to use cell phones, computers, QR scanning, and can't keep up with all of the technology and want to go to the bank and write a check. Bad news, guys, you're out and you're left behind on the trash heap. So I guess that comes back to
No, I suppose that comes back to Earth Hour versus Edison Hour, really.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
people get made into compost for the rest of the new generations. Millennials, as we're seeing, they love the kind of world we're living in right now with the structured environment and all the rules, and they're begging the government, please make more, or it'll make us feel secure. Whereas previous generations, like my one, they hate this stuff, and we can't work and we can't think, and it stresses us out, and we're sick of being told what to do. And we call that snowflake. And we were laughing at people who wanted that and calling them snowflakes, but they've turned the tables because guess what? They're the biggest generation. Yeah, well, they turned it exactly. I saw that on your
Yeah.
page. I like that one. So
Yeah.
now it's okay, Boomer. They've
Yeah.
turned it around. They've turned the
Yeah.
tables, and they're the new mainstream. They're calling the shots, and that's why we're in the state that we're in. So I see Clown World not as, because I'm a cyclical thinker, not a linear thinker. I see Clown World comes around and goes around from time to time, and it'll pass.
Yeah, so I think probably on the Clown World stuff, that's probably going to be our biggest disagreement. Well, I think we've got probably two primary disagreements. One is the Clown World stuff, and the second is the nature of reality and believing in God versus materialism. But on the Clown World stuff, the Clown World sort of philosophy, if you will, is that we are living in a state of clown world and have been for about the last 20 years, where everything is the complete opposite of the way it should be. And that previous generations lived a normal world, whereas we live in clown world.
No.
Where it would agree with you is that clown world is ultimately unsustainable, and it will end and it will be replaced by something better. But the Clown World Chronicles argues, and so would I, that the if not the only thing, the major thing that will get us out of Clown World is a sort of spiritual revolution. But I know you won't agree with that. But the last thing I'll say before I come back to you is, you said millennials like the world we're living in. I don't agree with you there. I think that millennials and the Z generation, because I'm 20, I'm younger than the millennials, I don't think they are particularly loving the world we're living in. I think people are living fairly empty, soulless lives. People are, that's why things like mental health issues are on the rise. They've never been worse. People are depressed. They're anxious at the thought of everyday life. There's children who can hardly get out of bed in the morning to come to school. There's, record numbers of people on antidepressant drugs. And I think most people get the sense that something's not right. There's a lot of different terms. One of them's over socialization, where with the advent of technology, it's great where the podcast like this can happen. You and I in our own homes can have a chat. That's great. But at the same time, despite all the technology and all the connection, a lot of people have never felt lonelier. So I guess I would disagree with you on that millennials are loving the world we're living in. Sure, I think they're a big fan of the material comforts they have, things like iPhones and all that. But at the same time, I think most people understand there's something deeply wrong. Would you agree with that or not?
No, because you're changing the context, and
Okay.
it QUA, millennial. The millennial's means of production and source of comfort is making all sorts of rules and locking things down and trying to make New Zealand into the way it was when they were at primary school and everything
But does
made
that make
sense.
them happy?
Millennial, yes, it does, but does it make them happy and fulfilled as human psychologically? That's a different issue. If you're talking about the cultural group, like almost corrected you before to be nuanced when you said there's no good policeman. Well, in terms of policeman, being a policeman and being a good policeman and beating people up regularly and taking bribe money for the right things, we've got a lot of good policemen. They're doing great. What a good job they're doing. But in terms
You're
of
right
being
there.
a human,
Yes.
it's not fulfilling. And this is the kicker, none of these moral cultures are, not even dignity culture, which is my favorite. This is the one that's dominant and I think you and I would have an affinity for. None of them are the right way to do things. None of them are fulfilling.
No.
They're really good. They've driven human culture and civilization for thousands of years, and it's very effective. Just like, say, Christianity's been, it's like a second best solution that's been working quite nicely for a while. But it's not ultimately fulfilling. It's not going to get you up the Maslow hierarchy of needs.
No.
It's not going to make you fully human, fully alive. It's not going to make you an anarchist. Well, being an anarchist is divorcing yourself from all of that. So this also answers your earlier question directly. Can we break the cycle? Should we break the cycle at our peril? And my answer is yes, that's what I'm trying to do. I don't want to be part of any of these identitarian groups at all. I want to lead people to an alternative.
So what would be an ideal world for yourself, Rick? So in terms of both a new culture, a replacement of culture, and what material things the New Zealand state could do to make this country more anarchist aligned or a better place to live, in your opinion?
Well, that's a contradiction in terms of, like, anarchism and statism are antitheses of each other.
They
There's
are.
nothing they can do. Just
They are,
disband,
but
go away, pack up your toys, get a real
if
job.
you if you were calling the shots, what would you change?
Well, I wouldn't be calling the shots, but
Well,
I
what would be
suppose the answer to
your
your question is to wind the clock back. I quite like New Zealand. The further back in time you go, the less statism there was, the more we were doing things for ourselves, and we've forgotten
what
that we
era would you
could.
say? What era would you take us back to?
Oh, I wouldn't. But I don't know how else to answer your question except to say that when we were pioneers, when we were settlers, we would
Yes.
just venture off into the bush and, would go down the old Telegraph Road and cut down some trees, and, then came the lawyers, and then came the rules, and the churches and the politicians followed on after. That's always been the history of New Zealand, that people invent something, create something, then the government comes along, bans it, takes it away, does a terrible job, and then rewrites the history books to act as if they came up with it, and you wouldn't be able to live without us, and this is why you pay taxes.
Yes. Well, that's exactly about your article about the replacement of the AA road signs.
Yeah, that's my latest one. That's amazing.
That's your latest one. They say, well, how could we ever have roads or anything if it wasn't for paying tax? Well, if people wanted to get from A to B and they needed an efficient way to do it, they'd team up and build a road.
And we did.
And it's the same, and we did. And then the government comes along, manufactures consent for taking away a third of our income and tax, and saying, oh, what would you do without us? You're exactly right.
You name it. Even not just road signs, and, anywhere you go, you'll see park benches and shelters and monuments and walls built by free people. And I was surprised when I went to Wanaka recently to see all of this, and everywhere I looked, nothing was put there by the government at all. And I also had a recent post about a big archway in Waipukurau, and it's been painted. It used to be Japanese and painted in traditional Japanese colors. And in recent times, a voluntary society, the Volunteer Fire Brigades, come along and fixed it. It was never made by the government, but they painted it blue, the colors of what's it called, the Central East Coast. I forget the name of that provincial area. They painted it in the government's colors and put a great big bloody government sign over it, as if it was, part of their brand, which is appalling. And they've forgotten who made these things. You look in the 60s, and there's a picture of an AA rubbish bin. The AA were picking up rubbish and emptying rubbish bins. They were doing all of this. Like, the government just came along after the, and even schools, for goodness sake. Do you think the government invented schooling? Not at all.
No.
They were up and running all around New Zealand, and they came along and slowly took them over. I've got posts about how they did it with television, with radio. Radio was held back for 20 odd years because as soon as New Zealanders started developing it, the government banned it. And the only ones who could practice and create, well, that came in the 60s. I'm talking about the turn of the century. The government banned radio and radio technology in 1903. Anyone but themselves was not allowed to do it, so nothing happened. The technology didn't develop. And just like the railways and the roads, the government came along after the fact and nationalised the damn thing. The only people who could work in radio were children because they couldn't be arrested. They were minors. So there's lots of stories that aren't told in mainstream government history about children developing radio technology. Of course, this year, or not this year, just last year, the government mainstream history was celebrating 100 years of radio, but it was not 100 years since New Zealanders were working in radio, but since the first state-sanctioned professor at a university started dicking around with the radio. And they were patting themselves on the back. Look at us, if it wasn't for government.
I remember hearing that on ZB,
Yep.
So why do you think is the primary reason they lie to us? And they lie to us from a young age at school. It's obvious why they do that. But why do you think is the major reason governments rewrite history?
Well, as I say, we want them to.
But what comes first?
We come first. Culture is upstream of politics. Politicians are just parasites. It's been that way since Hobson came along. Basically, they see a colony of thriving free people, and they say, geez, these guys are in desperate need of some leadership and some taxation. So when Hobson came to New Zealand, There were already plenty of settlers here. He basically explicitly came almost in a race around the world to try and beat the free people, the Cook Strait colonists, from getting here and setting up a colony. So he raced to New Zealand and did the same thing, declared New Zealand part of his province. I'm in charge of this. He didn't have any permission to do so from anybody. He declared himself lieutenant governor. A bit later, he declared himself governor. He declared that he was in charge of New Zealand long before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, but history revisionists have changed it, so our national day is when the treaty was signed. Actually,
1840.
Up until 1900 or so, everybody knew that it was in January because that's when Hobson arrived. He hadn't even set foot on the beach yet. He just said, "Yo, I'm the boss." And the treaty came after the fact. And, you're not going to read that in a mainstream government history book. If you want to read it, I have to write it so you can.
Yeah. So you say that politics is upstream from culture.
Downstream.
Downstream, sorry, got that around the wrong way. Do you not think that it's the state of affairs today is that politicians and the ruling class are pushing culture on us? You believe that it's entirely ourselves that are responsible for the culture and that it's never any other influence deciding our culture. Is that what you believe?
Yeah, absolutely. Brand activism and Countdown Supermarket in particular, but you name it, going woke as a branding strategy. And likewise, the politicians. The politicians are just good at sniffing out what's going on and then pretending that they believed it all along as much as they can. And if it changes, they reinvent themselves to survive. They're just parasites. They don't come up. They're not clever enough. They don't know what's going on. They're just opportunists, always have been. Find out what people's weak points are. Go up to Jerry Seinfeld with his low boundaries and get him to give you money so that he doesn't feel awkward or something. That's been the game all along.
I think that's another one of our major disagreements because I believe that a lot of the culture we have today is absolutely forced on us, and it's one big corrupt system, which obviously we've both agreed on. It's things like there's a chapter in the Clown World book called Science and Clown World. I'm not sure if you've read it, and it argues
Love that book, don't you?
I do love that book. It's I think one of the greatest books that's been written by a New Zealander, certainly in the modern era, and I think it will become more popular as time goes on. But as I'm saying, there's a chapter about science, and it argues that in Clown World, which is obviously the modern West, science is not primarily about finding out the truth, just like the education system is not primarily about finding out the truth or about discussing affairs. It's about pushing politics. And so science primarily has to serve the interests of the people funding it. It has to serve the interests of the ruling class. Would you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, isn't the natural conclusion also that politicians are pushing culture on us for their own benefit?
Only if you mistakenly define the ruling class as politicians and elites, whereas I would say that it should be defined as the mainstream of the moment, and that Clown World lasts about 5 years at a given time. We've had one every 20 years, and it will pass and it'll rise again. It always does. That's how this machine works. And so the elites and the mainstream is ever changing. So those are the ones calling the shots.
Yeah, I think I would define the ruling class a little bit differently. I would, as you say, the elites, the people that are in charge of this society, not just those with money, those with cultural power, those with money, those with cultural power, the politicians who are already in charge,
They're
the
not, though.
billionaires.
They're not
They're
in
what?
charge, is my point. They're not in my point. I know you think that, but I don't accept
Mm.
that they are in charge. They're just surfing a wave, but they are not the wave.
So who's in charge? Because if
You
we
are.
consider, but I think we agreed at the beginning of the show that democracy is really a sham. Democracy's basically dead, and that no matter who you vote for in Parliament, you're going to get the same result anyway. So why bother voting? So how can you say that there's no point in voting because it's a corrupt system, which we agree on? There's no point voting because nothing's ever going to change, and then say that we the people are in charge. How do you
Because
balance those two?
I don't mistake the great cathedral of facade, such as the electoral system, as being authentic, civil, human New Zealand spirit. And if you don't think that they're the same thing, then it's not a contradiction.
So you think it's the great new? All right. So I think we can largely agree that New Zealanders are a slave race. New Zealanders are a fairly enslaved people. Whether that's because I think we're we are slaves ourselves. We make ourselves into slaves, which we'll agree on. But that's also exploited by the people in charge, and that's why, for example, in New Zealand, no one hardly ever protests, and the anti-lockdown protests have been pretty small scale compared to what they've seen overseas. So we are largely a society that doesn't like to rock the boat. No,
disagree. That's just temporary. The mainstream has us at the moment. The mainstream is defined by millennial victimhood culture / slave culture. It's a temporary thing. Because they are the mainstream.
Don't you think we've always been slaves?
Absolutely not.
So other generations are not enslaved in the same way millennials are?
No.
Like boomers, for example.
I mean, in the past, for instance, if you wanted to enslave New Zealanders or get them marching or doing something, you'd wave the flag and play the British national anthem, and you'd go full jingoism, and they would go and bake some cookies and donate some woolen goods, and here's our community's donated a horse to your war, and off they'd go, and buy them a battleship and call it HMS New Zealand, and by the way, you're massively in debt, but look at this battleship. Thanks, Prime Minister Ward. This is fantastic. We'll vote for you again. Thanks for bribing us. So the way that you bribe people over the different New Zealand historical times has changed, and sometimes we're a slave culture and sometimes we're not. It's not sustainable.
When would you say is an example of a time period when we were not slaves in this country?
Well, let's see. Let's go for one of the high point most recently, the post-war era, where we were making durable goods, we were proud of ourselves, we had boomers. High national self-esteem, we were doing incredible things that they don't let us do anymore. We had business, we'd make our own toys, we had scientists developing our own inventions, we had doctors inventing new forms of heart surgery, all sorts of amazing, innovative things, and legitimate national pride that if you tried to do today, some red tape clipboard would come along and shut you down in 5 seconds flat and report you to work safe. That was a good time period.
How long after the post-war would that include, like, say, the Muldoon era, when there were all sorts of... No,
that was a different time period.
Aren't the same people who were living under the Muldoon Carlos Days era the same boomers that were around, or that were young, or that were being born in the post-war era when you say everything was so great? So your argument, I think our disagreement is that you argue people are sometimes slaves and sometimes not, whereas I'm arguing that people, if you're a slave, you're a slave. I think that's our disagreement.
You're a slave. That's tautologically, clearly true. How old were the boomers in the post-war era, though? Weren't they
that's when they're being born.
So they didn't have a whole lot of power over the country that they were in at that point, any more than millennials did 10 years ago.
Well, what I've argued in the last 2 podcasts is that the boomers are probably the worst generation we've ever had in the West, and that they inherited, as you say, as we've agreed, a great era, the post-war era, where people were wealthy, people were doing great things, people were buying houses, having families, were prosperous. And now that we are in, as history's moved on and boomers are now retiring and starting to die off, they've left us in a position where people can't buy a home, where people are really miserable. And I would put a lot of the blame at the foot of the boomer generation. But you wouldn't agree. You would put it entirely on the culture, but you don't think boomers have any responsibility for that culture. Am I right in saying that?
No, not at all. The responsibility is with that generation and the choices they made. And But,
Right. Well, I
in
agree.
empathy to them, they had a bad upbringing. They were produced en masse. They didn't get their serotonin when they were little kids. They were reared that way. They didn't, I don't know, they didn't have bad genes or
Yes.
some sort of nuclear fallout settled on them
No, I agree.
like ash and turned them all into evil boomers. They had it tough. They were raised that way. They were given all sorts of junk, and
They
they
were raised
grew
by
up.
people who'd been through hard times.
Arguably, yeah, they were
Yeah.
raised by people who are traumatized and been
Yes.
shaken by the war, but they
Yes.
were
Yes.
a protected kid because, why did we fight this war? We fought it so that we could be rich and prosperous, and now we're going to pave things with concrete and make the world look like Back to the Future when Marty McFly goes back to 1955 and everyone polishes your hubcaps. And they did live
Right.
in that world, and it was pretty damn good. But then the boomers grew up, just as the millennials have, and we had a spiritual awakening. We had a third turning, and is that right? No, we had a second turning. Thank you. That's another model that I use in anarchist history. This is from Strauss-Howe, the generational theory of turnings. So you're at a second turning, an awakening period, and these, as you'd be well aware, the boomers grew up and they had a big old spiritual awakening, or their version of it, and they started, having a summer of love and getting into drugs, going to Nambassa, Blurter.
John Lennon.
Sure thing. Just, early on there were the Beatles and there was Elvis, and that was very cathartic for a lot of them. I'm thinking of writing a post about that because it's Elvis's birthday shortly, and a lot of
that could
old
be very
boomers are
interesting.
thrilled. Yeah, that was a big deal because that was breaking them out of the old world, and they were finding their pace and who am I going to be? But then as the late 60s, early 70s dawned, you had all of these long-haired hippy-dippy people running around the country and forming cults and communes left, right, and centre, and driving all of the old generation crazy. And that's them coming of age, and that's when they took the reins. And so out of the ashes of that came the Muldoon era, basically a big man who came in response to another big man, Norm Kirk, and people were at that time thickly into personality culture, which led into, Muldoon was still around, and I call the era after him Muldoonist slave culture, where you got your Carless days and telling people what to do, and here's a price fix, and that was a slave
Interest
culture
rate
era.
controls.
Yep, and people were letting him do it. Think big, he called it, and I'll take your money and I'll put us into debt, and if you want to go overseas, you better tell my department how much money you're taking with you. If you want margarine, you better get a prescription for that. Super controlling.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're heading back that way, as you say, slave culture. But I would argue, and have argued on the podcast in the past, that Muldoon was the last prime minister who was governing as a nationalist rather than a globalist, and that every prime minister since then has been working in a specifically globalist agenda, and that globalism has been their primary goal. Would you agree?
I would. I think it happened on his watch. It's documented in history that he started off identifying all of the right problems that New Zealand needed to have fixed, but then mid-term he realised if he didn't win the next election, if he didn't start behaving himself, or that's not the right way to put it, if he wasn't going to keep the leadership of the National Party unless he won elections, and he could only win elections by prolonging the bullshit. So instead of having a big sort of Reagan Thatcher reform, which he started out doing, he got a big fright and went and saw the International Monetary Fund and did a big old turnaround and took New Zealand in a different direction. But what he inherited was Fortress New Zealand, which has its good points. Basically, New Zealand, like I talked about before, how the government froze things like the radio and television. And until someone came along and disrupted that, they just set us back 20 odd years. New Zealand really liked that post-war boom, right? It was a good time. And people wanted to stay living in 1955 until 1975, even though the rest of the world was moving on. And Muldoon was one of the men who tried to freeze the country because they could see that a lot of towns around New Zealand and industries, if they weren't protected, they'd go to the war. We wouldn't be able to, I don't know, make steel or make toys, all the
freezing
wonderful
works
things.
towns and things like that.
Exactly. And so we artificially put a lot of dead industries on life support for 20 odd years. and Muldoon tried to hold that fortress New Zealand for the people for that generation. But then what happened was Labour 4.0 came along, and they reformed the hell out of it, and they basically made up for 20 years of change in
one
weeks,
term.
months.
Yeah.
It all happened in a big hurry. So it was like, I don't know, tearing off a Band-Aid or something. So it was change that needed to happen, but it was very traumatic because of the way it was delivered. And, you know, again, people have themselves to blame because they kept on wanting this. They wanted, you know, their town not to be a ghost town. Like on the west coast of New Zealand, people were still digging up coal from the ground that nobody wanted to buy. And the government owned the coal mines, they nationalised them, and the coal was heaping up and heaping up and heaping up. Eventually, somebody had to say, you know, I'm sorry, I really like that you vote for me, but you're unsustainable, you're gone, bye. And off they went. And then it took another 20 years for these piles of mountains of coal to be depleted because there's a huge stockpile of unwanted stuff. That's an analogy for what New Zealand was like. When Longi came in with 4.0, Labour 4.0, he said that he inherited a country that resembled a Polish shipyard.
Yeah. Given, so I put a lot of the blame, and you've probably heard me argue it in the last couple of podcasts, that the reason why the boomers are screwed up as a generation is because they have a complete absence of spirituality. They don't believe in God.
No, they do. They are the awakening generation. They are.
Do you think they do believe in God?
Their version, yeah. I mean, unless you want to privilege your version and say that.
Well, what's their version?
Well, think of the 60s and flower power and hippy dippy stuff. That was all them, you know, long hair.
But that's materialism.
Well, if you want to privilege your version of what it is to be spiritual, then yeah, everyone but you can't be spiritual. But that for them, that was their approach to it, and it was legitimate to them. That was spiritualism. That was awakening. They were much more interested in that early phase in the non-corporeal world, non-tangible world than the one that they'd inherited, because they were a shadow culture of those that came before, who were eminently practical, who were, you know, fighting wars and making sure food.
The greatest generation and the silent, yeah.
Sure. And the boomers were like, yay, everything's free. We can take that for granted. Let's smoke dope and generally run our country into the ground. It's always been there. It'll always be there.
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right there. But where I disagree is that all the peace and love stuff, that was materialism. I mean, the biggest cultural icon for a long time of the boomers was John Lennon, who was famously a materialist. I mean, you know, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. He didn't believe in God, and neither did most boomers. They saw it as, you know, a relic of the past, and because people had
that doesn't make them non-spiritual, though, unless you want to privilege your version of what spiritual is. You gotta,
well, what would you
know, as a sociologist, we learn that there are different ways of being. There are different approaches to things.
Well, they don't believe in God.
Okay, well, there are non-divinity based spiritual beliefs too, you know.
Yeah, sure, but I think in the sort of mainstream context, the archetypal boomer, the generation as a whole, and obviously, you know, people are individuals, they are largely a godless generation. They've not believed in anything but themselves. They, I think Vince McLeod calls it egotheism. It's the third hurdle of elementalism, but that's another thing.
Wow.
It's it's where they worship themselves. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in the church. They don't believe in genuine spiritual tradition. But largely, they believe purely in materialism. And all right, whether you argue that,
like me,
yes, like you, let's accept that. Okay, the 70s peace and love, 60s that summer of love. Let's say that was spiritual. Okay, let's just say that for a minute. Since then, they've long since abandoned all that. And George Carlin said that they went from the generation that said, love is all you need to just say no, or they've gone from, being that peace and love to whoever has the most toys wins. And they've even if they ever did believe in anything spiritual, they've completely rejected that by now.
Always. That's what happens to every generation or every system. This is as above, so below. Like, you can look at fractal theory and see this happening in clouds, and it's this idea of enantiodromia, where something
right.
transitions into its opposite. So the boomers started off as super spiritual, flowers in the hair. We
Yep.
don't need to wipe our asses and we don't need to
Circular
change our bed
glasses.
sheets.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And
Yep.
over time, and this is how we know them. Like, you and I weren't around in the 60s to observe
No.
the antithesis. We know them now as the equal and opposite reaction, where they're uber materialists and they're sucking up all of the values of our
Yep.
forefathers and everything that they earned for themselves, and putting the future
Everything that
generations
we're
into debt.
producing. Yes.
Yeah, it's all for them.
Yep.
So they've made
Yep.
that 180 transition, just like every generation before them.
So all right, people have argued that the generations since have gotten even more godless. I mean, I'm 20 years old. Most people my age don't believe in God, and those that do in New Zealand are normally immigrants, and they've been brought up that way. But I think most young Westerners don't believe in God, I think is probably a fair statement. Do you believe that they'll complete a full 180 of that and come to being very spiritual as time goes on?
Yeah, that's the framework. Those who start off as, in who aren't philosophical and haven't reasoned from first principles, therefore you're subject to culture, and that will be your driver, and it'll throw you around and decide when you're an innovator or decide when you're a conformity and in the mainstream, and then it'll decide when you're compost. And so you just get thrown around and treated that way. So people who get treated that way, sometimes they'll make that transition from being aspiritual to super spiritual, for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I've argued with Vince McLeod, and I've argued it to a lot of people, that I think my generation, the Z generation, or possibly even the one after us, the Alpha generation, will be the ones to bring in a new spiritual age, and that won't be in the same way that the boomers spent, 10 or 20 years running around with flowers in their hair and circular glasses and listening to John Lennon. Not in that sense, in a sense that there will be a widespread, genuine, I guess, spiritual revolution or a new spiritual age in favor of believing in God, and that will enable us to observe the nature of reality and escape victimhood culture, personality culture, clown world, everything.
It'll just
That's what
perpetuate it.
you think, that'll perpetuate it.
Absolutely. And I agree that there will be another awakening. I think it's Generation Z plus 2. I think Generation Z plus 1's going to be a firebrand generation that's, going to throw off the shackles. And then we'll have another awakening right on cue, 80 years after the previous one, every time.
So those will be the children that I don't think even been born yet. I think we're still in the Alpha generation, and in 3 years' time, I think, as the next generation starts. So you think it's children that haven't even been born yet will be the ones?
Yeah. Well, according to if you want to have a historical theory, then that would be on schedule. That's how these things have always happened before.
Right. No, that's interesting. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Rick. It's been an interesting discussion, but I think for the last little bit, talk a little bit more about Anakiwi. So tell me a little bit about it. How long you've been running the site, and what sparked your interest in anarchist history?
Similar to wanting to read anarchist history, I had to write it. I found that I wanted to be around more people who were not statists, and instead of looking around for them, where the hell are they? There's got to be a conversation going around. I decided to I didn't found Anarchiwi. I just picked it up and became the guy who was running it.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, 3 or 4 years ago, I suppose that happened. And
who was running it originally?
I'd have to look that up. Or yeah, I haven't named them because those guys, they had a kind of an outpouring. There was a big flash in the pan with someone called Hans Hermann Hoppe or something.
Okay.
One of these Nordic dudes, and everyone got excited for a wee bit, and then it kind of abated, and they cleared out, and I think they went back to their day jobs, and I don't think they're
Wow.
as excited about those ideas as they were. There's a real good sort of dignity culture period back there where
Yep.
people thinking in terms of models and not being personality culture and just towing the line. It was a really fertile time for people to try on new ideas and have genuine debates and talk to each other. And it emerged from that. And I jumped in there and
Okay.
started perpetuating it because I decided instead of me searching for this group, I just put up a lighthouse and people can come to me. So
Yeah.
people can
Yeah.
find Anarchy where they can find the website, enter it in the search menu and find out all sorts of things about it. And in particular, I wanted someone else to do it, and since they didn't, I wanted a vehicle to put anarchist history in. So
Yeah.
Anarkiwi is an overarching group which other anarchists can contribute to. So once you become an
Yeah.
anarchist, get on in there.
Awesome. Well, so what does the future hold for Anakiwi? Are you looking to possibly publish a book or do more sort of video type stuff? Obviously, you are looking at other writers on the horizon.
Yep.
What do you think the future holds for the platform?
I am coming around to this idea that, particularly at the moment, the generations, the culture, it's not like it was back in the early libertarians' day and in the early
Yep.
days of blogging, where we could write big articles and share them and quote them and read them and comprehend them. People
Yeah.
are not willing to do that anymore. So
No.
the format that I've used ain't working so well. It works very well for me because I get to have lots of nuanced ideas and I get to
Yes.
keep on creating data points for these history cycles that I'm trying to learn about. So I'm thinking podcasting's a bloody good idea, and perhaps I should pick that one up. And geez, I could
Yeah.
do podcasts for years to come just by reading out all of the posts that I've created to this point.
Well, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I've been podcasting not for very long now, but I've done, I've had I think another 2 episodes with a guest. I'm interviewing you today. I've got another podcast tonight. I'm doing one with Stephen Berry on Saturday. So it's sort of taking off, and I think um, alternative media, whether it's I guess you could call Anakiwi alternative media or alternative history. Same with the JTFP, my podcast, or VJM Publishing. I think it's incredibly important, as you say, in the age of um, schools teaching us lies and just lies upon lies from the government. It's incredibly important to have conversations like this, platforms like this, and as you say, people reading a great big massive article that's not quite so popular now, and podcasts are certainly the way to go. So it's certainly been great to have you on, and I'd definitely be glad to have you on again at some stage, or to host a
Yeah.
debate or whatever else. But I think
Maybe we can take on something specific like an era or an event
yeah,
in New Zealand history and explore them. And I'm glad
absolutely,
you approached me because I've been listening to your podcast now and I'm enjoying them. And it doesn't matter if I disagree with things. It's quite inspiring.
yeah.
And I think, geez, Jackson's doing all right. I could do that too.
Yeah, no, no. Thanks for that, Rick. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think what we've found is that we've agreed on quite a few things. We've also disagreed on some things, but where we're able to agree, we're really able to sort of drill down into that, if you will. And where we disagree, we can certainly in future sort
Ah,
of flesh that out a bit more.
see, that's
But I think
interesting. It's not a typical conversation where I put up my totem gods and say and point to them and say, my authority figure says this and you're doing the same. That's the typical discourse these days, and yeah, we haven't
yeah.
been doing that, have we?
No, I think it's been a good discourse because we've been able to sort of both express our opinions and both take on what we've both been saying, and I've certainly learned a lot. I hope the people watching have learned a lot, and hopefully you can um, promote this to your audience, and they can learn more about you. And yeah, and I really do like your idea that in future we perhaps pursue something a bit more specific. And I think we could create some really good content about the anarchist history of New Zealand.
Thank you very much.
All right, Rick, it's been great to interview you, and look forward to hearing you again sometime.
Thanks, mate. Take it easy.
Thank you very much.